They say the deadliest shot in the West wasn't some swaggering gunslinger or hardened lawman, but a quiet woman who could thread a needle at dusk and split a playing card at 100 paces. Folks who passed through Silver Creek in the summer of 1875 would have never guessed that the gentle-handed Tailor working in that sun-faded shop was the same legend who'd outshot Wild Bill Hickok in a friendly competition and put 5 bullets through the same hole at 50 yards. Sarah, steady hand. Mitchell had hung up her rifle 3 years ago, trading gunsmoke for the whisper of thread through fabric, but legends have a way of resurfacing, especially when fate comes knocking with violence in its heart. Before we delve into the story that would shake Silver Creek to its foundations, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy tales of justice served cold, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story about the ghost marshal of Dead Pine will keep you on the edge of your seat. Silver Creek wasn't much different from any other mining town that had sprouted up in the Colorado Territory. A main street lined with weather-beaten buildings, perpetually dusty windows, and enough hopes and broken dreams to fill the abandoned mines in the surrounding hills. The only thing that set it apart was Miss Mitchell's shop, with its neat display of finely tailored clothes and a sign that read, "Mitchell's Fine Tailoring," in carefully painted letters. Sarah Mitchell had chosen Silver Creek precisely because it was unremarkable. After the incident in Dodge City that left 3 men dead and her reputation as steady-hand Mitchell blazing across newspaper headlines, she'd sought anonymity like a drowning person seeks air. Her small shop, with its organized workspace and the rhythmic clicking of her sewing machine, became her sanctuary. Sheriff Thomas Reed, a veteran of both the Civil War and 15 years of frontier law enforcement, often found himself studying Miss Mitchell during his daily patrols. There was something about the way she moved, a fluid grace that seemed at odds with the simple life of a tailor. Her hands never trembled, even when working the finest stitches, and her eyes held a watchfulness that reminded him of veteran scouts he'd known during the war. "Something about that woman," he told his deputy one quiet evening, "reminds me of a thoroughbred trying to pass itself off as a plow horse. Ain't natural for anyone to be that still." If the sheriff harbored suspicions about his town's tailor, he kept them to himself. Silver Creek had been peaceful since her arrival, and her work brought a touch of refinement to the rough-edged mining town. But peace in the territories was as fragile as morning frost, and change rode into Silver Creek on a cool September morning in the form of the Thorne Gang. Jack Thorne and his brothers had carved out a bloody reputation from Texas to the Dakota Territory. Unlike common bandits, they specialized in taking over small towns, bleeding them dry through protection rackets and rigged card games before moving on to their next target. They entered Silver Creek like they owned it already. 6 riders led by Jack Thorne himself, their horses' hooves throwing up dust that settled on Miss Mitchell's freshly cleaned windows. Sarah was fitting young Mary Cooper for a wedding dress when she heard the commotion outside. Her fingers never paused in their work, but her eyes flickered to the loose floorboard beneath her cutting table, the one that concealed a wrapped oilcloth package she hadn't touched in 3 years. "Looks like we've got visitors," Mary said, nervously, watching through the window as the riders dismounted. "Nothing to worry about, dear," Sarah replied softly, her voice carrying the same soothing tone she used when explaining complex alterations to customers. "Now, let's see about adjusting this hemline." But even as she worked, a familiar tension crept into her shoulders, the same tension she'd felt before every shooting competition, every confrontation. The weight of her past hung heavy in the air, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Silver Creek's peace was about to be shattered, and steady-hand Mitchell was about to discover that some skills, like some reputations, can never truly be buried. The Thorne brothers didn't waste time making their presence known in Silver Creek. Jack, the eldest, strode down the boardwalk like a wolf, sizing up its hunting ground, his spurs ringing against the weathered wood. Behind him, his brothers Matt and Luke flanked him like shadows, while their 3 companions spread out along the street, hands resting casually near their holsters. Sheriff Reed watched from his office porch, one hand absently stroking his graying mustache. He'd seen their type before, men who mistook cruelty for strength and fear for respect. His deputy, young Billy Hammond, tensed beside him, but Reed placed a calming hand on his arm. "Easy, son. Sometimes the best way to handle a rattler is to watch where it goes before you decide how to deal with it." Inside her shop, Sarah Mitchell continued her work on Mary Cooper's wedding dress, though her movements had taken on an almost imperceptible precision that went beyond mere tailoring. Each pin she placed, each measurement she took, was executed with the same calculating focus she'd once used to evaluate wind speed and distance on the shooting range. The bell above her door chimed, and dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that accompanied Jack Thorne's entrance. He filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his black duster still carrying trail dust, his eyes taking in every detail of the shop with predatory intelligence. "Well, well," he drawled, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Ain't this a surprise? A proper tailor in a dirt heap like Silver Creek." His eyes settled on Mary Cooper, who clutched her partially fitted dress closer. "And such lovely customers, too." Sarah set down her pins with deliberate care. "I'm afraid we're in the middle of a fitting, sir. Perhaps you could return later." Her voice was soft, maintained at the same gentle tone she always used, but there was steel beneath the silk. Jack Thorne's smile never reached his eyes. "Oh, I think the young lady won't mind if we borrow a moment of your time. You see, my brothers and we're businessmen of sorts. We're looking to invest in Silver Creek's future, and every business on this street will want to be part of our arrangement." Mary Cooper, sensing the tension, gathered her things. "I should go, Miss Mitchell. We can finish the fitting tomorrow." She hurried past Thorne, who made no move to stop her, his attention fixed entirely on Sarah. "Now then," he continued, running a finger along a rack of finely made shirts, "let's discuss your contribution to Silver Creek's prosperity. Say, $10 a week for protection? Times are dangerous after all. Would be a shame if anything happened to such fine workmanship." Sarah threaded a needle with steady hands, seemingly absorbed in her task. Is that what happened in Copper Springs and in Dead Man's Gulch? Just business arrangements gone wrong? Something flickered in Thorne's eyes. Surprise, quickly masked by calculation. "You seem well informed for a simple tailor." "News travels," she replied, tying off her thread. "Like the news of how Copper Springs burned when its people couldn't pay your prices, or how the sheriff in Dead Man's Gulch was found face down in the street when he objected to your methods." Thorne's friendly demeanor evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. He leaned across her work table, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Careful, woman. Knowledge can be dangerous, especially for those who don't know their place." Sarah finally looked up, meeting his gaze. For just a moment, something in her eyes made him straighten up, though he couldn't have said why. "Everything has its place, Mr. Thorne. And it's time." He recovered quickly, laughing to mask his momentary discomfort. $10 a week starting today. My brother Luke will be by to collect at sunset." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And Miss Mitchell? Don't make him come looking for it. Luke has a temper, and he ain't as polite as me when it comes to business." As the bell chimed his departure, Sarah returned to her sewing, but her fingers, still precise, now moved with the rhythm of another kind of familiar motion, one that had nothing to do with making clothes, and everything to do with the loading of cartridges into a rifle's magazine. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek's main street, and word of the Thorne gang's business proposals spread from shop to shop like wildfire. The hour of decision approached with the setting sun, and Sarah Mitchell's carefully constructed piece was unraveling one stitch at a time. As sunset approached, Sheriff Reed made his way to Mitchell's Fine Tailoring, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. The street had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that reminded him of battlefields just before the shooting started. Through the front window, he could see Sarah Mitchell working at her sewing machine as if it were any other day. "Miss Mitchell," he said, entering the shop. The bell's cheerful chime seemed out of place in the heavy atmosphere. Thought you might want some company when Luke Thorne comes calling. Sarah didn't look up from her work, the needle rhythmically puncturing fabric. That's kind of you, Sheriff, but unnecessary. I can handle Mr. Thorne's younger brother. Reed watched her hands, still steady, still precise. You know, he said carefully, something's been puzzling me these past 2 years. Way you came to town, bought this shop with cash, set yourself up quiet-like. Most folks who come to Silver Creek are running to something or from something, been trying to figure out which one you are. Now she did look up, and Reed saw something in her eyes that confirmed his suspicions. Maybe both, Sheriff. Does it matter? Might. Especially with the Thornes in town. He moved closer to her work table, lowering his voice. Funny thing about reputations, they have a way of following folks. Take Steady Hand Mitchell, for instance. Famous shooting champion disappeared about 3 years back, right after that business in Dodge City. 3 men dead, all known gunfighters, each shot through the heart at 50 paces. Sarah's hands finally stilled. I heard she died in a riverboat accident on the Mississippi. Body never found. That's one story, Reed agreed. Another is she got tired of men challenging her, trying to make their names by beating her. Story goes she was fastest shot anyone had ever seen, but hated the killing, wanted a quiet life. He paused, studying her face. Wouldn't blame her myself. Must be exhausting, carrying a reputation like that. Before Sarah could respond, the shop's door burst open. Luke Thorne swaggered in, younger than Jack but meaner, like a rattler looking for something to bite. 2 of his companions flanked the doorway, hands resting on their guns. Time to collect, Miss Mitchell, Luke announced, grinning with artificial friendliness. $10, just like Jack said. Weekly insurance against any unfortunate accidents. Reed turned slowly. Evening, Luke. Didn't know you boys had gone into the insurance business. This don't concern you, Sheriff, Luke snapped, his hand drifting toward his holster. Private business arrangement between Miss Mitchell and us. Everything in my town concerns me, Reed replied calmly, especially when it involves threatening law-abiding citizens. The tension in the small shop grew thick enough to cut. Luke's fingers twitched near his gun, his face darkening with anger. But before anyone could move, Sarah's quiet voice cut through the silence. The money's on the counter, Mr. Thorne. She nodded toward a small stack of coins. Counted out exactly. Luke's surprise showed briefly before his arrogant grin returned. He swaggered to the counter, scooping up the coins. Smart woman. See how easy business can be when everyone understands their place? He turned to leave, then added over his shoulder. Same time next week. Don't make us come looking. After they left, Reed turned back to Sarah. You didn't have to pay them. Yes, I did, she replied, returning to her sewing. For now. Sometimes, Sheriff, you have to let events unfold in their own time. Like when you're lining up a difficult shot, rush it, and you'll miss what you're really aiming for. Reed studied her thoughtfully. You know they'll be back for more. Men like that, they're never satisfied. Sarah's fingers moved across the fabric with deadly precision. Yes, she said softly. They always come back. That's what men like the Thornes do. They mistake silence for weakness, patience for fear. They never learn until it's too late. As Reed left the shop, the setting sun painted Silver Creek's main street in shades of blood red. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed something significant. Not the beginning of the Thorne gang's reign of terror, but the first, quiet steps of its eventual downfall. In her shop, Sarah Mitchell continued working as darkness fell, her hands steady as ever. But now they moved with a different purpose, measuring and marking with the same precision she'd once used to calculate. Bullet trajectories in the wind. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek about how the quiet Tailor had paid the Thorne gang's demands without resistance. Some folks nodded approvingly at her pragmatism, while others whispered that such compliance would only encourage the outlaws. But none of them noticed how Sarah Mitchell spent her evenings after closing shop, or the way she'd taken to leaving her back door slightly ajar, as if expecting a visitor. That visitor came 3 nights after Luke's collection, slipping through the back door like a shadow. Samuel Deadeye Davidson had ridden 2 days hard from Pueblo when he received Sarah's telegram. The legendary scout moved silently through the back room, finding Sarah at her workbench, mending a shirt by lamplight. "Been a long time, steady hand," he said softly. Sarah didn't look up from her work. "Almost 3 years, Sam. Take a seat. There's coffee on the stove." Davidson poured himself a cup, studying his old friend. "Your telegram said the Thorns found you. Didn't mention what you plan to do about it." "They haven't found me," Sarah corrected, her needle moving with precise rhythm. "They found a Tailor. There's a difference." "For now," Davidson agreed, "but you know their reputation. They'll push harder, demand more. Eventually, they'll either break you or make you show your hand." Sarah finally looked up, and Davidson saw the familiar steel in her eyes. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. Tell me about their patterns, Sam. You've been tracking them longer than anyone." Davidson sipped his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "They start small, protection money, like they're doing here. Then they bring in more men, start taking over businesses outright. Anyone resists, they make examples of. They've got about 20 riders total, but they're smart about it. Never show their full strength until they're ready to take complete control. And the law? Won't help. They've got deputies and marshals bought off across 3 territories. That's why no one's been able to build a case against them. Any lawman tries, they either end up dead or discredited." Sarah's hands never stopped their work, but her eyes grew distant, calculating. "How many men in town now?" 8, counting all 3 Thorn brothers. "Got another dozen camped in the hills north of town, waiting for Jack's signal." Davidson leaned forward. "Sarah, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you need to know. These aren't common bandits. Jack Thorn was Army intelligence during the war. He plans everything down to the last detail." A ghost of a smile crossed Sarah's face. "So I noticed. The way they positioned their men when they first rode in. How they're gathering information about everyone's routines. Military precision. That's why I needed you here, Sam. Need to know exactly what we're dealing with." "We?" Davidson raised an eyebrow. "Thought you gave up the shooting game." "I gave up the competition circuit," she corrected. "Gave up letting men challenge me to prove themselves. This is different." "How so?" Sarah's needle paused mid-stitch. "Because this time, I'm choosing the fight. On my terms, in my way. But I need your eyes, Sam. Need to know their movements, their habits, everything." Davidson nodded slowly. "Might take a few days to gather what you need. But Sarah," he hesitated, "once you start this, there's no going back. Your quiet life here will be over." "It was over the moment they rode into town," she replied, returning to her sewing. "I just don't think they realize it yet." As Davidson slipped out into the night, Sarah moved to her window, watching the moon cast shadows across Silver Creek's main street. In the saloon across the way, she could see Luke Thorn and his men drinking and laughing, celebrating their easy conquest of another town's spirit. But they hadn't counted on the iron will behind her quiet demeanor, or the deadly skills hidden beneath her gentle hands. They saw what they expected to see, a woman alone, running a small shop, easy prey for their kind of predator. They didn't realize that sometimes the prey was actually the hunter, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Sarah smiled. The sound reminded her of the long nights she'd spent practicing on her father's ranch, learning to shoot by starlight until her aim was as natural as breathing. Soon, Silver Creek would learn why she'd earned the name Steady Hand and the E. Thorn Gang would discover that their biggest mistake wasn't choosing this town. It was choosing her shop as their first target. The next week brought changes to Silver Creek, subtle at first like a shadow creeping across the land. More of the Thorn Gang's men appeared in town, drifting in ones and twos, taking rooms at the hotel or setting up camp on the outskirts. They moved with military precision, just as Davidson had noted, establishing observation points and mapping out the town's rhythms. Jack Thorne held court at the Silver Pass Saloon, conducting his business with the calculated efficiency that had made him infamous across 3 territories. His intelligence network grew as fearful townspeople shared information, hoping to curry favor. But Sarah Mitchell noted how his men always positioned themselves with clear lines of sight to her shop's entrance. "Getting crowded in town," Sheriff Reed commented one morning, stopping by her shop under the pretense of having a button reattached. "Counted 5 new faces yesterday alone. None of them look like they need much tailoring." Sarah threaded her needle with practiced ease. "Notice that, too. They're watching everyone's routines, learning patterns." She glanced up briefly. "Especially mine." "Matt Thorne's been asking questions about you," Reed said quietly. "About how long you've been here, where you came from." "Might be they're getting suspicious." A thin smile crossed Sarah's face. "Let them ask. Everything they'll hear is true. I'm just a tailor who came here for a quiet life. The best disguise is an honest one." Later that afternoon, Luke Thorne swaggered into her shop for the weekly collection. But this time, he wasn't alone. Matt Thorne, the middle brother and the gang's chief intelligence gatherer, accompanied him. While Luke collected the money, Matt wandered the shop, studying everything with shrewd eyes. "Fine work," Matt commented, running his fingers along a displayed jacket. "Remarkable detail. Takes steady hands for stitching this precise." His tone carried hidden meaning. "That's kind of you to notice," Sarah replied, keeping her voice mild. "I've always believed that anything worth doing is worth doing well." "Indeed." Matt picked up a spool of thread, rolling it between his fingers. "You know, there's something that's been bothering me, Miss Mitchell. Your name sounds familiar somehow. Reminds me of stories I heard back in Kansas. About another Mitchell." "It's a common name," Sarah interrupted softly, "especially in Kansas." Luke, growing impatient, rattled the coins in his hand. "Come on, Matt. Got other collections to make." But Matt wasn't finished. He moved closer to Sarah's workbench, his voice dropping. "Funny thing about that Mitchell from Kansas. They called her Steady Hand. Famous for shooting competitions. Then one day in Dodge City, 3 men tried to make a name for themselves, challenging her. None of them survived. Story goes, she vanished after that." Sarah continued her sewing, each stitch perfectly spaced. Tragic story. "But I fail to see what it has to do with a simple tailor in Silver Creek." "Simple tailor," Matt repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that's exactly what you appear to be. But my brother Jack, he always taught us to look deeper. During the war, he learned that appearances can be deceiving. That sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones hiding in plain sight." Sarah finally looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the game they were playing. Then she smiled, and it was just the pleasant expression of a shopkeeper again. "Your brother sounds like a wise man, Mr. Thorne. Now, will there be anything else? I have a dress to finish for young Mary Cooper's wedding." Matt studied her for a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the door he paused. "You know, Miss Mitchell, Jack's also taught us that it's better to deal with potential problems early, before they have a chance to become real threats." After they left, Sarah sat motionless at her workbench, her fingers finally still on the fabric. Through her window, she watched Matt Thorne cross the street to the saloon, already deep in conversation with his older brother. The game was shifting, just as she'd expected it would. The hunters were starting to sense that their prey might be more dangerous than they'd assumed. Davidson, watching from the shadows of the livery stable, saw it all. That evening, his report to Sarah would confirm what she already knew. The time for hiding behind her needle and thread was running out. The Thorne gang moved into their next phase of operations just as the autumn wind began stripping leaves from the cottonwoods along Silver Creek. Jack Thorne, having established his presence and tested the town's resolve, started tightening his grip. The protection money doubled overnight, and those who couldn't pay found themselves facing brutal consequences. Old Man Henderson's general store was the first example. When he came up short on his payment, Luke Thorne and 2 others ransacked his shop, destroying stock and breaking windows while the townspeople watched helplessly. Sheriff Reed arrived too late, finding only scattered goods and Henderson nursing a badly beaten arm. "It ain't right," Deputy Hammond said, helping clean up the mess. "We're supposed to protect people." "Sometimes," Reed replied, picking up a shattered lamp. "Protecting people means waiting for the right moment to act. Even a rattlesnake shows itself eventually." Sarah watched the cleanup from her shop window, her fingers moving steadily on her sewing machine. But beneath the table, hidden from view, lay the oilcloth package she'd retrieved from beneath the floorboards. Each night after closing, she'd been practicing, her muscle memory returning like an old friend. That evening, Davidson slipped into her back room with fresh intelligence. "They're moving faster than usual," he reported, accepting a cup of coffee. "Jack's got word that a large silver shipment's coming through next week. He means to take the whole town before it arrives." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "Makes sense. They'll want control of all escape routes, every vantage point." She studied the town map they'd spread across her cutting table. "How many men up in the hills now?" 15, all armed with army rifles. "Jack's planning something big, Sarah. Matt's suspicious about you have them spooked enough to change their usual pattern." A small smile touched her lips. "Good. Nervous men make mistakes. Tell me about their guard rotations." Davidson detailed the gang's movements, the patrol routes, the watch changes, the signals they used. Sarah absorbed every detail, her mind working like the precision tools she used for tailoring, measuring, and cutting away excess until only the essential remained. "There's something else," Davidson added hesitantly. "They sent a rider to Denver yesterday. Matt's been asking about a woman matching your description, specifically about shooting competitions from a few years back." "Let them ask," Sarah replied, calmly. "By the time they get any answers, it'll be too late." Their conversation was interrupted by heavy boots on the front porch. Sarah quickly rolled up the map while Davidson slipped into the back room. The bell chimed as Matt Thorne entered, followed by 2 of his men. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," Matt said, his voice carrying false politeness. "Working late, I see." "These wedding alterations won't finish themselves," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "Something I can help you with?" Matt moved to her counter, placing a torn jacket there. "Need this mended. Seems I caught it on a nail." The tear, however, looked suspiciously like a bullet graze. "By tomorrow, if you could." "Of course." Sarah finally looked up, her face professionally neutral, though I couldn't help but notice it looks more like lead damage than nail damage. Dangerous thing, getting shot at. Matt's eyes narrowed slightly. Indeed. Almost as dangerous as being a woman alone in a town like this. Accidents happen so easily. He leaned forward, dropping his voice. "You know, it's interesting. We still haven't found any records of where you learned your trade. No apprenticeship? No family connection to tailoring?" "Some skills," Sarah replied softly, "are best learned in private." "Yes," Matt agreed, studying her face. "Like shooting, perhaps." The tension in the shop grew thick enough to cut with scissors. Through her window, Sarah could see Luke and several others positioning themselves across the street, hands near their weapons. "Your jacket will be ready tomorrow, Mr. Thorne," she said, returning to her sewing. "Though you might want to be more careful. Next time the shooter might not miss." Matt's face darkened at the subtle threat, but he controlled himself. "Good evening, Miss Mitchell. Do be careful with those needles. Wouldn't want you to slip and hurt yourself." After they left, Sarah continued working by lamplight, her movements precise and measured. But now each push of the needle, each cut of the thread, carried the rhythm of another kind of precision, the sort that had once made her famous from Kansas to the Dakotas. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with gunfire. 3 shots shattered the morning quiet, followed by breaking glass and frightened screams. Sarah was already awake, having spent the night working on Matt Thorne's jacket, when she heard the commotion from the Silver Pass Saloon. Sheriff Reed found Marcus Hayes, the saloon owner, sprawled across his own bar, blood seeping from a shoulder wound. Luke Thorne stood over him, smoke still curling from his revolver. "Just a friendly reminder," Luke announced to the gathering crowd, "about the importance of honest business practices. Seems Mr. Hayes here was watering down the whiskey he sold us. Can't have that kind of dishonesty in town, can we?" Sarah watched from her shop door as they dragged Hayes to the doctor's office. Her eyes noted every detail, the positioning of Thorne's men around the street, the way Jack watched from the hotel balcony, the scared faces of townspeople quickly looking away. "It's starting," Davidson murmured, appearing beside her like a shadow. "Jack's getting bolder, showing the town what happens to anyone who resists." "No," Sarah replied softly. "He's showing his hand too early. Fear only works when people have something left to lose." She turned back to her shop. "Tell me about the rider they sent to Denver. Returned last night. Went straight to Jack's room at the hotel. Whatever news he brought, it's got them stirred up. They've doubled the guards. Around town." Sarah nodded, running her fingers along a bolt of fabric. "Matt's inquiries about my past are bearing fruit. Good. Let them worry." The bell chimed as Mary Cooper rushed in, her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Mitchell, they're coming. The Thornes. They're going door to door, searching everyone's shops and homes." Sarah's expression remained calm, though her mind raced through calculations. "Thank you, Mary. Best hurry home now." As the girl left, Sarah turned to Davidson. "My rifle? Hidden in the church bell tower, just as you asked. Ammunition, too." He paused. "You sure about this? Once they search here—" "They won't find anything suspicious," Sarah interrupted, moving to her workbench. "Just thread, needles, and fabric. A woman's simple tools." Sure enough, within minutes, Matt Thorne entered. With 4 men, they began ransacking the shop, pulling out drawers, overturning furniture, all while Sarah continued working on a dress alteration. "Careful with those patterns," she said mildly, as they scattered paper across the floor. "They're arranged in a specific order." Matt approached her workbench, studying her calm demeanor. "You don't seem surprised by this visit, Miss Mitchell." "Should I be?" "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Thorne, though I admit I expected more finesse from a former Army intelligence officer." Matt's eyes narrowed. "You know quite a bit about us." "Just what people say," Sarah replied, measuring a seam. "About how you gather information, plan your moves, eliminate threats before they become problems." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Tell me, did your rider bring back interesting news? From Denver?" The question hit like a physical blow. Matt's hand moved toward his gun, but Sarah continued sewing, seemingly unconcerned. "You're playing a dangerous game," he warned. "No game, Mr. Thorne. Just a simple tailor doing simple work. Though I did finish mending your jacket, the one with the bullet graze. Interesting angle of the tier. Suggests the shooter was firing from above. Rooftop, maybe." The threat in her voice was subtle, but clear. Matt's face hardened as he gestured for his men to finish their search. They found nothing. No weapons, no ammunition, nothing to confirm his suspicions about the quiet. "Tailor with the steady hands. We'll be watching you," he said as they left. "Of course you will," Sarah replied softly. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." After they were gone, Sarah began cleaning up her shop, each movement precise and measured. Through her window, she saw Jack Thorne conferring with his brothers, their gestures animated, their faces dark with concern. Davidson reappeared from his hiding place in the back room. They're scared now. Scared men are dangerous. Scared men make mistakes, Sarah corrected, picking up scattered fabric. And when they do... She let the sentence hang unfinished, but her eyes held the cold precision that had once made her famous across the territories. The afternoon brought an unusual visitor to Mitchell's Fine Tailoring. Emma Hayes, Marcus's wife, slipped into the shop while Sarah was closing up. Her face bore the tired look of someone who'd spent hours at a sickbed, but her eyes held a strange determination. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." From her shawl, she produced a carefully folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "Found this in an old Denver paper. Thought you might want to see it." Sarah unfolded the paper carefully. The headline read, "Steady hand, Mitchell triumphs again, sharpshooting sensation outguns, top marksman at Kansas State Fair." Below was a faded photograph of a woman holding a rifle, her face younger but unmistakable. "I remember reading about you," Emma continued. "How you could shoot a playing card edge-on at 50 paces. How you never lost a competition." She paused, lowering her voice. "How those men in Dodge City tried to hurt you, and ended up dead instead." Sarah studied the woman before her. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my husband's lying in Doc Wilson's back room with a bullet in his shoulder. Because the Thorns are destroying everything we've built here." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Because we need the woman in that photograph, not a tailor." Sarah carefully refolded the clipping. That woman brought nothing but death and challenge. Every man with a gun wanted to prove himself against her. Every town she visited ended up with blood in its streets. "And this town?" Emma demanded. "What do you think is happening here? The Thorns are going to kill Marcus anyway, make an example of him. They're going to keep pushing until they own everything, everyone." Before Sarah could respond, the shop's door burst open. Luke Thorne swaggered in, followed by 2 of his men. His eyes fell on Emma. "Well, well, Mrs. Hayes, shouldn't you be tending to your loving husband?" His mock concern carried an edge of menace. Emma straightened her spine. "I was just leaving." She moved toward the door, but Luke grabbed her arm. "What's that in your hand?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "A dress pattern, Mr. Thorne." Mrs. Hayes was considering having something made for the church social. Her eyes met Emma's. "Though perhaps now isn't the best time." Luke's grip tightened on Emma's arm. "Show me." Emma's hand trembled as she held out the newspaper clipping. Luke snatched it, his eyes widening as he read. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Matt was right," he said softly. "All this time, right under our noses." He turned to Sarah. "You've been playing us for fools, haven't you, a steady hand?" Sarah continued folding fabric, her movements unhurried. "That photograph is from 3 years ago, Mr. Thorne. Ancient history." "Oh, I don't think so." Luke crumpled the clipping in his fist. "Jack's going to want to see this, and then..." He shoved Emma toward the door. "Then we'll see just how steady those hands really are." After they left, Davidson materialized from the back room. "This changes everything. They'll come for you now." Sarah moved to her window, watching Luke drag Emma across the street toward the hotel. "No, Sam, this changes nothing. It just moves up our timeline." She turned to him, and for the first time he saw the famous steel in her eyes that had made her a legend. "Get word to Reed. Tell him to get the women and children into the church basement tonight. And Sam..." She paused. "It's time to get my rifle." Davidson studied her face. "You sure about this?" "Once you pick up that gun again..." "I never stopped being who I am," Sarah replied softly. "I just stopped letting others define me by it." She moved to the loose floorboard, pulling out not just the oilcloth package, but a gun belt she'd kept hidden for 3 years. The Thorns. Wanted to find Steady Hand Mitchell? Well, they just did. As darkness fell over Silver Creek, lights began going out across town as people hurried to secure themselves behind locked doors. In the hotel, Jack Thorne gathered his brothers for a war council, while in the church tower, a rifle that had become legend across the territories waited for the touch of familiar hands. The quiet tailor shop stood dark and empty, its owner's elegant handwriting displayed on a simple sign in the window, closed for alterations. The afternoon brought an unusual visitor to Mitchell's Fine Tailoring. Emma Hayes, Marcus's wife, slipped into the shop while Sarah was closing up. Her face bore the tired look of someone who'd spent hours at a sickbed, but her eyes held a strange determination. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." From her shawl, she produced a carefully folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "Found this in an old Denver paper. Thought you might want to see it." Sarah unfolded the paper carefully. The headline read, "Steady Hand, Mitchell triumphs again. Sharpshooting sensation outguns top marksman at Kansas State Fair." Below was a faded photograph of a woman holding a rifle, her face younger, but unmistakable. "I remember reading about you," Emma continued. "How you could shoot a playing card edge-on at 50 paces. How you never lost a competition." She paused, lowering her voice. "How those men in Dodge City tried to hurt you and ended up dead instead." Sarah studied the woman before her. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my husband's lying in Doc Wilson's back room with a bullet in his shoulder. Because the Thorns are destroying everything we've built here." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Because we need the woman in that photograph, not a tailor." Sarah carefully refolded the clipping. That woman brought nothing but death and challenge. "Every man with a gun wanted to prove himself against her. Every town she visited ended up with blood in its streets." "And this town?" Emma demanded. "What do you think is happening here? The Thorns are going to kill Marcus anyway, make an example of him. They're going to keep pushing until they own everything, everyone." Before Sarah could respond, the shop's door burst open. Luke Thorne swaggered in, followed by 2 of his men. His eyes fell on Emma. Well, Mrs. Hayes, shouldn't you be tending to your loving husband?" His mock concern carried an edge of menace. Emma straightened her spine. "I was just leaving." She moved toward the door, but Luke grabbed her arm. "What's that in your hand?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "A dress pattern, Mr. Thorne." Mrs. Hayes was considering having something made for the church social. Her eyes met Emma's. "Though perhaps now isn't the best time." Luke's grip tightened on Emma's arm. "Show me." Emma's hand trembled as she held out the newspaper clipping. Luke snatched it, his eyes widening as he read. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Matt was right," he said softly. "All this time, right under our noses." He turned to Sarah. "You've been playing us for fools, haven't you, Steady Hand?" Sarah continued folding fabric, her movements unhurried. "That photograph is from 3 years ago, Mr. Thorne. Ancient history." "Oh, I don't think so." Luke crumpled the clipping in his fist. "Jack's going to want to see this, and then—" He shoved Emma toward the door. "Then we'll see just how steady those hands really are." After they left, Davidson materialized from the back room. "This changes everything. They'll come for you now." Sarah moved to her window, watching Luke drag Emma across the street toward the hotel. "No, Sam, this changes nothing. It just moves up our timeline." She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw the famous steel in her eyes that had made her a legend. "Get word to Reed. Tell him to get the women and children into the church basement tonight. And Sam," she paused, "it's time to get my rifle." Davidson studied her face. "You sure about this? Once you pick up that gun again—" "I never stopped being who I am," Sarah replied softly. "I just stopped letting others define me by it." She moved to the loose floorboard, pulling out not just the oilcloth package, but a gun belt she'd kept hidden for 3 years. "The Thorns Wanted to find steady hand Mitchell. Well, they just did. As darkness fell over Silver Creek, lights began going out across town as people hurried to secure themselves behind locked doors. In the hotel, Jack Thorne gathered his brothers for a war council, while in the church tower, a rifle that had become legend across the territories waited for the touch of familiar hands. The quiet Tailor shop stood dark and empty, its owner's elegant handwriting displayed on a simple sign in the window, closed for alterations. Jack Thorne's military expertise showed in what came next. His men moved in coordinated groups, using covering fire to advance, while others threw oil-soaked rags onto nearby buildings. The night filled with smoke and muzzle flashes as they attempted to reduce Sarah's visibility and force her to make a mistake. "They're trying to smoke us out," Davidson warned, coughing as acrid smoke drifted through the tower. Sarah's rifle cracked twice more, dropping 2 men who'd ventured too far into the open. No, they're creating chaos. The smoke's cover for something else. Her eyes, trained by years of shooting competitions to spot the smallest details, caught movement at the hotel's back entrance. "There, Matt's leading a group around behind the church." "I'll handle it," Davidson said, moving to the tower's other side. But Sarah caught his arm. "Wait, let them come." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Sometimes the best shot is the one you don't take yet. Below, Luke Thorne's voice carried over the gunfire. "Your reputation's built on competition shooting, Mitchell. This is war. You're not facing paper targets now." Sarah's response was another precision shot that knocked a torch from a gang member's hand, sending him scrambling for cover. Through the smoke, she could see Jack Thorne in the hotel doorway, directing his men with hand signals she recognized from her father's stories about the war. "Sam," she called softly, "remember that trick shot we used to practice? The one with the bell?" Davidson's eyes widened. "That's mighty risky in the dark. So is letting them surround us." She shifted position, sighting along her rifle. "When I give the word, shoot the bell rope." The smoke grew thicker as more buildings caught fire. Sheriff Reed and his deputy had their hands full organizing a bucket brigade, keeping the flames from spreading while trying to avoid gunfire. In the chaos, Matt Thorne's flanking group had almost reached the church's back entrance. Sarah's breathing slowed, falling into the familiar rhythm of a difficult shot. She could feel the night wind's direction, sense the subtle shifts in the air that could affect a bullet's path. All around her, Silver Creek had become a battlefield, but in her mind, she was back on her father's ranch, learning to shoot by starlight. "Steady," she whispered to herself. "Like threading a needle." Her rifle spoke once, the bullet striking the church bell at precisely the right angle. The sound rang out across the town, and in that moment of distraction, Davidson's shot severed the bell rope. The massive bell crashed down through the rear scaffold, exactly where Matt's group had been climbing. The crash was devastating. Matt and his men tumbled from their positions, their carefully planned assault ruined. Sarah's next shots picked off their weapons with surgical precision, leaving them exposed and disarmed. "Matt!" Jack's voice carried real fear for his brother. "Damn you, Mitchell!" "Your brother's alive," Sarah called back, her voice carrying that same calm she used with nervous customers. "They all are, but that changes if you keep pushing." In the street, Luke Thorne had heard enough. With a roar of rage, he broke from cover, firing wildly at the tower. Sarah's response was a single shot that sent his gun spinning from his hand, followed by another that nicked his ear. "That's your last warning," she announced. "The next one goes through your heart, Luke, just like those men in Dodge City." Sudden silence fell over Silver Creek, broken only by the crackling of fires and the moans of Matt's injured men. Jack Thorne, seeing his brother Matt disarmed and Luke standing weaponless in the street, faced a decision that had never been part of his careful planning. "Last chance, Jack," Sarah's voice carried clearly in the night air. "Call off your men. Leave Silver Creek, or find out why they called me Steady Hand." Davidson, watching through his scope, saw the calculating look leave Jack Thorne's eyes, replaced by something he recognized, The fear of a man realizing he'd walked into a trap, of his own making. The night held its breath, waiting to see if the next sound would be surrender or slaughter. Sarah's finger rested lightly on her trigger, her hands as steady as they'd been when sewing the finest seams. The time for alterations was over. Jack Thorne had built his reputation on careful planning, on anticipating every possible outcome. But nothing in his military training had prepared him for this moment. Through the smoke of his burning diversions, he watched his brother Luke, standing defenseless in the street, Matt and his men lying amid the wreckage of the fallen church bell, all undone by a tailor with a rifle. "It's over, Jack," Sarah called from her position. "You've lost 12 men tonight, all wounded, none dead. That's not by chance." Her voice carried the same measured tone she used when explaining complex alterations. "I chose my shots, just like I chose this town, this shop, this moment." Luke Thorne, blood trickling from his nicked ear, snarled up at the tower. "You think you've won? We've still got men in the hills. We'll burn this whole town down," a new voice answered. Sheriff Reed's, calm and clear. "Those men won't be joining us." He stepped into the firelight, Davidson beside him. "Territorial Rangers picked them up an hour ago. Seems someone sent them." "Detailed information about your whole operation." Sarah's rifle cracked once more, the bullet splitting a playing card that had fallen from someone's pocket during the fight. The pieces fluttered in the smoky air. "That was at 70 yards in the dark through smoke. Imagine what I could do with a clear line of sight." Jack Thorne's mind raced through options, calculations, possibilities. But for the first time in years, he found himself without a plan. His carefully constructed strategy had been undone by a woman who'd spent 3 years pretending to be less than she was, waiting for the right moment to be more. "Dodge City," he said finally, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. "Those men who challenged you, you didn't kill them because you had to. You killed them because they didn't give you any other choice." "They wouldn't back down," Sarah agreed, softly. "Are you smarter than they were, Jack?" Around them, townspeople had begun emerging from their hiding places. Emma Hayes stood in front of the doctor's office, a shotgun in her hands. Rebecca Mitchell and others took up positions, armed with whatever weapons they could find. The town itself seemed to be awakening, transforming from prey to predator. "You played us perfectly," Matt Thorne called from his position near the fallen. Bell, nursing a broken arm, "Made us think we were the hunters." 3 years, Sarah replied. 3 years of watching men like you destroy towns like this. 3 years of waiting for the right moment, the right target. Your gang wasn't just another group of outlaws. You were organized, methodical. Taking you down meant something. Jack. Thorne looked at his brothers, Luke standing weaponless in the street, Matt trapped beneath the wreckage of his own failed plan. His men were scattered, wounded, or captured. The careful hierarchy of fear he'd built was crumbling like the ashes of his smoke signals. "Even if we surrender," Luke spat, "others will come. Everyone knows Silver Creek is weak, ripe for taking." Sarah's laugh was soft, but carried clearly. "You still don't understand. After tonight, everyone will know that Silver Creek is where the mighty Thorne gang met Steady Hand Mitchell, where their military precision was outshot by a tailor with a rifle." Another shot rang out, splitting Luke's belt buckle clean off his pants. "That's the story that will spread." Dawn was breaking over the mountains, the first rays of sun cutting through the smoke. Jack Thorne saw his empire crumbling in that light. Undone not by force but by patience, not by armies but by precision. "Your choice, Jack," Sarah called one last time. "Surrender to the Rangers, face a proper trial, or find out if the stories about Dodge City were understated." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the Territorial Rangers approached from the north. Jack Thorne, veteran of war and architect of criminal enterprise, finally did something he'd never done before. He raised his hands in surrender. In the church tower, Sarah's finger eased off the trigger, but her aim never wavered. She watched as Reed and his deputy began disarming the gang members as the Rangers rode into town to take custody of the infamous Thorne brothers. 3 years of waiting, Davidson said softly beside her. Was it worth it? Sarah finally lowered, her rifle, her hands as steady as ever. Ask the town, she replied, watching the sunrise paint Silver Creek in shades of hope. The morning after the battle found Silver Creek taking stock of its wounds. Buildings bore bullet holes and scorch marks. Windows gaped with broken glass, and the fallen church bell lay amid splintered timber. But unlike other towns the Thorn gang had visited, Silver Creek was still standing, its spirit unbroken. Sarah Mitchell stood in her shop, surveying the damage. Bullets had shredded her display of fine shirts, scattered her carefully organized patterns, and splintered her beloved sewing machine. Yet her hands remained steady as she picked up scattered spools of thread and straightened overturned furniture. Quite a mess, Sheriff Reed said, entering through the broken door. Town council's already approved funds to help rebuild. Seems the least we can do for the woman who saved Silver Creek, Sarah continued her cleaning. The town saved itself, Sheriff. I just provided the timing. And the shooting, he added with a slight smile. Territorial rangers are mighty impressed. Captain Wilson said he's never seen anything like it. 12 men wounded, each shot placed perfect to disable without killing, even in the dark, even through smoke. Killing's easy, Sarah replied softly. Precision is harder. Like tailoring. Anyone can cut fabric, but making it fit perfectly, that takes skill. She paused, holding up a bullet-torn dress. Speaking, of which I need to remake Mary Cooper's wedding dress. Can't have her walking down the aisle in something full of holes. Reed studied her carefully. You're staying then? Even with your secret out? Before she could answer, Emma Hayes burst into the shop, her face flushed with excitement. Miss Mitchell, you need to see this. She thrust a newspaper into Sarah's hands, a special edition of the Silver Creek Gazette. The headline read, Legendary. Sharpshooter saves town. Steady hand. Mitchell defeats Thorn Gang without a single death. Below was a detailed account of the previous night's events, alongside a reproduction of the old Kansas photograph. It's spreading across the territory, Emma continued breathlessly. Riders are carrying the story to every town. The Thorn Gang, brought down by a tailor with a rifle. And the way you did it, no killing, just precision shooting. It's changing the story of Steady Hand Mitchell. Sarah set the paper down carefully. Stories can be dangerous things, Mrs. Hayes. They have a way of following you. That's what we're counting on, Reed interjected. Every would-be outlaw gang between here and Kansas will think twice about causing trouble in Silver Creek now. They'll know this is the town where Steady Hand Mitchell hangs her hat and keeps her rifle. Through her broken window, Sarah could see the town coming back to life. Marcus Hayes, arm in a sling, was already supervising repairs to his saloon. The church bell was being hoisted for repair, its bronze surface dented but unbroken. Townspeople moved with a new confidence, nodding respectfully as they passed her shop. Davidson appeared in the doorway, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Rangers are moving out with the prisoners. Jack Thorne asked to speak with you before they left. Sarah shook her head. Nothing left to say. He made his choices, just like I made mine. And what choice are you making now? Davidson asked quietly. The shooting circuit would welcome you back. Your reputation's bigger than ever. Sarah picked up her needle and thread, testing their familiar weight against the memory of her rifle's trigger. 3 years ago, I ran from who I was. Came here, looking for peace, thinking I could bury my skills beneath needle and thread. She smiled slightly. But maybe there's a way to be both, the tailor who makes wedding dresses and the woman who can shoot a playing card at 70 yards. Emma touched her arm gently. Silver Creek needs both. Every town needs someone who can create beauty and protect it. Through the broken window came the sound of hammers and saws as repairs began across town. Sarah could see Mary Cooper approaching with her bullet-torn wedding dress, hope bright in her young eyes. Well then, Sarah said, threading her needle. With steady hands, we'd better get started. This town's not going to rebuild itself. She smiled at Mary. And we've got a wedding to prepare for. The morning sun streamed through the broken windows, catching the silver thread in Sarah's hands and making it shine like rifle brass. Outside, Silver Creek was changing, becoming something stronger than it had been before, just like its resident, Tailor, who had finally found a way to weave together all the threads of who she was. Word travels fast in the territories, carried on horseback and whispered in saloons. Within a week of the Thorn Gang's defeat, Silver Creek found itself hosting an unusual variety of visitors. Some were journalists, eager to interview the Tailor, who'd outshot the West's most organized gang. Others were lawmen, hoping to learn how one woman had accomplished what entire Perseus couldn't. But there were darker visitors too, gunslingers and would-be legends, drawn by the story of Steady. Hand Mitchell's return. They'd swagger into town, hands hovering near their guns, only to find Sarah calmly working at her newly repaired shop window, her rifle visible but untouched on mounted hooks above her sewing machine. "Ain't you gonna face me?" one young gunslinger demanded, his voice carrying the bravado of youth. "I've won 6 duels." Sarah didn't look up from the vest she was altering. "This is a tailor shop, not a shooting gallery. Though your jacket could use taking in at the shoulders, the fit's all wrong for quick drawing." Her calm refusal to be baited, combined with Sheriff Reed's firm stance on avoiding trouble, sent most challengers away frustrated but alive. The few who pushed harder found themselves disarmed by precise shots that seemed to come from nowhere, though Sarah was always found peacefully sewing when investigated. "You've changed the game," Davidson told her one evening, sharing coffee in her back room. "The story's different now. Not about the killing in Dodge City anymore, but about the night you stopped the Thorns without taking a life." Sarah measured a length of fabric with practiced precision. "Stories are like patterns, Sam. People cut them to fit what they need to see. The truth is usually more complex." Speaking of complex, Davidson nodded toward a stack of letters on her workbench. "Those job offers keep coming in. Territorial rangers, private security for the railroad, even a shooting exhibition tour. Good money in all of them." "Better money in tailoring," Sarah replied, though her eyes strayed to the rifle above her. "Especially now that Silver Creek's growing." And growing it was. The town's reputation for being under the protection of Steady Hand Mitchell attracted legitimate businesses and settlers. The railroad, impressed by how the town had handled the Thorn Gang, accelerated plans for a new spur line. New buildings rose along Main Street, including a proper dressmaker's shop run by Mary Cooper, now married and apprenticing under Sarah. But perhaps the most significant change came in the form of young girls who'd visit the shop, watching Sarah work with quiet admiration. They weren't drawn by her shooting skills, but by the way she'd chosen her own path, balancing strength and precision in everything she did. Emma Hayes, now helping run the saloon while Marcus recovered, brought her daughter by one afternoon. "She wants to learn to shoot," Emma explained, "and to sew. Says a woman should know how to create beautiful things and protect them." Sarah studied the girl's determined face. "Both skills need the same things: patience, precision, and steady hands. We'll start with sewing. The shooting can come later, if you still want it." That evening, as Sarah closed her shop, she found Sheriff Reed waiting outside. "Got word from the Rangers," he said quietly. "They're transferring the Thorns to the territorial prison tomorrow. Jack asked again to speak with you." Sarah shook her head. "Nothing to say. The time for words passed when they chose violence." Reed nodded, understanding. "You know, when you first came to Silver Creek, I thought you were running from something. Now I see you were actually waiting. Not just for the right moment, but for the right place to be who you really are." Through her newly repaired window, Sarah could see her reflection in the gathering dusk, the tailor and the sharpshooter finally woven together into a single pattern. On her workbench lay tomorrow's projects: a wedding dress needing delicate lace, a gun belt requiring careful stitching, and letters from young women across the territory asking to apprentice with the woman who'd mastered both needle and rifle. "The thing about patterns," she told Reed, "is that once you find one that fits perfectly, you don't need to keep looking for others. Silver Creek fits." She smiled slightly. though we might need to order more glass for the windows. I saw 3 more gunslingers ride in this afternoon. Planning to shoot out any more windows? Reed asked with a wry smile. Only if necessary, Sarah replied, her hands steady as ever. But sometimes the strongest message is the shot you don't take. 3 months after the night that changed Silver Creek forever, Sarah Mitchell stood in her shop, making final adjustments to a display of winter coats. The street outside had transformed. New storefronts gleamed with fresh paint, the repaired church bell rang clear and true, and a sign for the coming railroad station had been erected near the town square. The bell above her door chimed, and she looked up to find Captain Wilson of the Territorial Rangers entering, his hat in his hands. "Miss Mitchell," he said formally. "Thought you'd want to know. The Thorne brothers were sentenced yesterday. 20 years each." Sarah nodded, continuing her work. "And their men?" "Most took deals, testified against the brothers." "Luke's still cursing your name, but Jack—" Wilson paused. "Jack asked me to deliver a message. Said you weren't just the better shot, you were the better strategist. Said waiting 3 years to set up the perfect position, that's something he wished he'd thought of." "It wasn't strategy," Sarah replied, adjusting a collar. "It was finding the right place to belong." Through her window, she could see Mary Cooper teaching a group of young women basic marksmanship behind the church, while Emma Hayes supervised. After Sarah's example, more women in Silver Creek had taken up shooting alongside their traditional skills. They weren't gunslingers or show shots, just citizens who'd learned they could be more than one thing. Davidson appeared in the doorway, his saddlebags packed. "Time for me to ride, steady hand. Got word of trouble up in Montana territory." Sarah set down her work and approached her old friend. "You could stay, Sam. Town's growing. Could use experienced hands." He smiled, shaking his head. "Some of us are still hunting, Sarah, but it helps knowing there's a place like this, where the hunting can end." He looked around the shop. "You've created something unique here, a place where strength and grace aren't at odds." As if to prove his point, a young girl burst into the shop, clutching a torn dress and a target sheet with 3 perfect bullseyes. "Miss Mitchell, look what I did today!" Sarah examined both the shooting and the tier with equal attention. "Good grouping, Jenny. Now let's see about fixing this dress. A steady hand is just as important with needle as with rifle." Later that evening, as Sarah closed her shop, Sheriff Reed joined her for their now traditional end-of-day coffee. 4 more families arrived today, he reported. All heard about Silver Creek, the town too tough for the Thorne gang, protected by a Tailor, who shoots straight and sews straighter. "Stories," Sarah said, shaking her head. "They grow bigger with each telling." "Maybe," Reed agreed. "But some stories need to grow. Gives people something to believe in, something to measure themselves against." Sarah watched the sunset paint the street gold, catching the silver thread she'd used to embroider her new shop. Sign, "Mitchell's Fine Tailoring and Marksmanship Lessons. Alterations of all types available." "You know," Reed continued thoughtfully, "when you first came here, this was just another quiet town waiting to be victimized. Now it's becoming something else, a place where people learn they don't have to be just one thing, just one story." Sarah's hands moved steadily, organizing her threads by color as she did every evening. Each spool caught the light differently, like the varied facets of the life she'd built. "Sometimes the strongest armor isn't steel," she said softly. "It's knowing exactly who you are." Through the gathering dusk, the sound of practice shots echoed from behind the church, followed by the gentle whir of sewing machines from the dressmaker's school. Sarah smiled, hearing the harmony in those contrasting sounds. She'd found her pattern at last, not running, not hiding, but weaving together all the threads of who she was. "More gunslingers will come," Reed noted, finishing his coffee. "Let them come," Sarah replied calmly, her hands steady as ever. "They'll either learn what Silver Creek has to teach, or they'll leave with a new understanding of precision." As night settled over the town, Sarah Mitchell, tailor, shooter, teacher, protector, lit her shop lamp and began work on a new dress, her rifle hanging within easy reach above her sewing machine. In its gleam, she caught her reflection. No longer a woman divided, but whole at last, as precise and true as the shots she'd fired on that fateful night. The legend of steady hand. Mitchell had become something more than tales of speed and accuracy. It had become a story of transformation, not just of a woman or a town, but of the very idea of what strength could look like in the West.